We're here with Dr. Rinsing today, and we're going to ask him some more specific questions relating to his research. Thank you for coming to sit down and chat with me for a while about your topics of interest. And I was wondering if you would go over change blindness, since that seems to be one of your main research areas. How would you conceptualize visual representations within the context of your change blindness paradigm?
Well, yeah, I would say that the way we see is not the way we think we see. So we think we've got a complete representation of everything in the world. And instead, what we have is a much sparser system. It's a just-in-time system. So what we do is we represent, of course, we represent a lot of detail at any instant, but that goes away very quickly. Just close your eyes and most of that goes away. So we need to have a way of having a more durable representation, something that makes sense of the world in a way that's meaningful to us. So what you want to do is have a way of, for example, you think you see all the events in front of you. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now clearly you know that that can't be, because you need attention to see change, you need attention to see an object, you need attention to see an event. But we can only attend to a few things at once. There's no more than that. That's it, right? Mm-hmm. That's a hard limit. So the question is, if we can only see, one or two objects or events, why do we feel we see all of them? Mm-hmm. And so it turns out that my proposal is that we actually have a just-in-time system, a way of creating a representation of what you need when you need it. So if I look at you, I attend to you, I create a representation. If I look at someone else, I would create a representation of them. And as soon as I'm done with it, it dissolves. So it goes back to this very kind of volatile, short-term, very limited memory representation. And what happens instead is that you just go from object to object to object, and it appears, because you're creating them when you need them, it appears if they're there all the time. It's like if you open the fridge door, right? The light's on, mm-hmm. and you ever wonder, is the light always on? Or, right? Is it just on when you open the door? And of course, it's hopefully this. It's, it's the latter one. Yeah. So basically, the visual system does the same thing. It only creates these objects when you need them. And you typically, only attend to one or two things at a time, right? So you have that representation, and as soon as you're done, it's kind of like closing the door. It's just gone, and then you're on to the next object. Mm-hmm. So this is an idea of, it's called virtual representation. It seems as if everything is there, but in reality, there's only a couple things represented at any one time. So again, it's like the refrigerator. The light's only on when the door's open, right? Mm-hmm. And again, these objects are represented only when your attention is on them, and that's it. So what you have then is a very different view of visual representation. In the older idea that was very common when I was a student, people thought you built up a representation, that you had a buffer, that you would take all your eye movements and build all these pixels and create objects and more objects, and when you had enough objects you had the whole scene, and that was the way it went. So the emphasis was very much on construction. And now what we're seeing is the emphasis instead is on coordination. We have a dynamic representation, this just in time. So rather than construction, we've got coordination. And we still build some stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But we have much more in the way of active construction, a kind of intelligence that sort of lets us build certain things at certain times. So if you like, there's actually a nice analogy with biology. In the old days, they had decided that genes, right? Mm-hmm. Genes would create proteins. Every gene would create a protein. And so construction, all about construction. And what biologists have found, geneticists have found, is that most of the genes, in fact, are there to coordinate. There still are some that, will get you bones and blood and everything else, but most of the genes actually coordinate the processes of the rest. And so, oddly enough, there's a similarity there now in vision, that we do create representations. We still create objects, and we have, an idea of layout and space and all this, but most of what we do here is coordinate. We're just getting the right thing to the right object at the right time.
Could you talk a little bit more about how attention plays a little bit more in the formation of visual representations?
Yeah, sure. It's actually an interesting thing, because our understanding of what attention does is completely reversed from what it used to be. So it used to be thought that, attention it was basically needed for everything. And it was kind of like this gateway that everything you ever did required attention. And what we found is actually that's not the case, that it's needed for some things, in fact, for more stuff than we thought. So in other words, what happens is the stuff we thought it wasn't needed for, like change, we now find it is. Right? So it used to be thought that, oh, you can just see change, it just happens, and you get it somehow. And no, you need attention. On the other hand, a lot of stuff that we thought attention was needed for isn't. So it's kind of flipped. And for example, you can do a lot of grouping, a lot of this kind of work, any kind of visual organization, right, perceptual organization. People used to think, oh, you need attention for that. And now we find, no, you can do a lot of this non-attentionally, pre-attentively. So a lot of intelligence happens without attention. And then, so like I say, it's kind of interesting in inversion. And so what you've got really is also, in addition to this, you've also got systems, for example, that operate with no attention ever, right? If it turns out, for example, if you want to look at your systems that guide your hand when you reach for something, those are completely separate systems than the ones that give you a picture. So there's no attention involved in this whatsoever. So what we're finding now is that attention does a bit more than we thought in terms of change and objects and everything else. It's critical for these. But the funny thing is that it also does a lot less. It's not involved with action. It's not involved with perceptual organization. So the old idea that was this kind of, it was the center of everything. It's a little bit like the old idea that the Earth was the center of everything, right? The geocentric view of the universe, they called it. And we had what you might think of as an attentocentric view, that everything was about attention. And now what we're finding is attention, it's kind of like the Earth. It's like a cool planet. It does a lot of stuff. It lets us see, change and objects and all kinds of things. But it's only one of several systems, and they all kind of operate in parallel. So just like all the planets are kind of doing their own thing, these other systems are doing their own thing. So attention is really important. I mean, the Earth is really important, right? It's really cool. I'm not wanting to dismiss it too much, but I'm saying we have to change our view of what it is in the grand scheme of things. There are these other systems that we have that have nothing to do with attention and are quite wonderful in their own right.
How much information can be readily stored? For example, in your change blindness paradigms, people are initially displayed one image, but it's only briefly displayed. Like, how much information can you actually take in that very transient period? Yeah,
it turns out that you can take in a lot of information in a transient period. So in other words, when you open your eyes, right, there are literally millions of bytes of information coming in. It's a very high-res picture. And in fact, right, there's about 1 million, axons, right, in the optic nerve. So about 1 million each is about a byte. So you got 1 million bytes right there. So you've got a lot of information coming in, and these things get formed into edges, and so there's a great density. Okay, so this, I believe, occurs as long as your eyes are open. The only thing that happens, though, is that they don't last very long. So as soon as you close your eyes, for example, they die out for the most part. So you still have a little bit of a memory left. Okay, which later on I'll say will help guide things, but the richness is very transient. So unless you have attention, things don't last. So another way of looking at it is, in the old days, attention was thought that it knitted things together in space. That you needed to join features or like little pieces. That you needed to group something. You had to have attention. So attention role was knitting things together in space. And that's still somewhat true. But the other thing is, we're now realizing that it also is needed to knit things together in time. So we're having like a space-time theory now, a little bit of attention, right? So it actually connects different things in time, just like it connects different pieces in space.
Okay, going back to the change blindness paradigm, could you explain a little bit about motion perception and iconic memory and how that relates to the duration of the mask interval between the original stimulus and the change stimulus?
So what happens is with a change blindness experiment, a lot of information is coming into your eyes all the time, but it's not staying there, right? So what you need to do to see the change, you have to have some way of grabbing onto it to actually, I would say, create a coherent representation, something that knits this together. Because when you see something change, you have to know it's the same thing, right? Other, it's just A, it's just B, it's A, it's B, who cares? There's no, enduring constancy underneath it. So you need attention for this, right? So what I would say then is the case that in change blindness experiments, you typically have a large blank, or relatively large, about say a quarter second, right? And what'll happen is that this is long enough, you'll see this stuff and then it'll disappear, see the stuff disappear, see the stuff disappear. So unless you're attending the right thing, unless you're creating this coherent representation, it all just goes away, right? Now what happens is, as that gap gets smaller, okay, you still don't have any real way of combining the information, but what you do is you have motion detectors come in. So motion detector will go, hey, something just flashed and something here is a little bit different. Okay, you'll get, so you get a motion thing. If I go like this, right, there's motion. Okay, you're actually picking up the motion of my hands. We have specialized motion detectors for that. So as you actually get these gaps, they become narrower and narrower. When they come sort of around 100 milliseconds or shorter, this actually fits into the time window of these motion detectors. So you're still not knitting things together yet, because without attention you can't. But what you are finding, there's this motion detector that then can pick up the fact that, oh, now it's bright, now it's dark, and begin to get a signal from that. So these motion detectors begin to go, hey, there's a change over here, and it sends your attention there. And that's why when you get very, very brief gaps, the motion detectors go off, and they'll send attention there, and you can usually see the change pretty quickly.
Okay. And the other thing that, now that I'm recalling it, it was iconic memory. I was wondering if you could talk about iconic memory and how it also plays a role in that as well. Yeah,
iconic memory actually is something that's not as well understood as most people think. So I would say that iconic memory, in a simple way of looking at it, it's a memory trace. That it's what happens after you close your eyes, right? Like I was saying, you've got a rich representation formed. Okay, there is quite a lot there, but it's not, it's volatile. Okay, that's what I call it. It doesn't last a lot. It doesn't have a permanence there. It's gone within a quarter second. So as soon as you close your eyes, what remains is a memory, and this is iconic memory. This is what, you can actually probe it with a partial report task. You can read off, ask people to read off the letters over here, and you can do it for a little while. So it hangs around for about a quarter second or half a second. So that then is partly how iconic memory fits in here. So it really is the sort of, if you like, the tail end of this volatile nature, this volatile representation I was talking about. That's iconic memory. Now, it turns out that there's more to the story than this, is that there's newer work that I've been working on, is just coming up within my lab this last year or so, is that iconic memory used to be thought of as kind of a copy. It's like a picture, it's like a photograph. That is, it only lasted for half a second or a quarter second, right? But as long as it lasted, you could do anything with it that you could with the real thing. So you could read from it, and you can do all kinds of stuff, right? It turns out that's not the case. So for some processes, you certainly can read off letters, and you can read off whatever you like, but it turns out that some things you cannot use it for. So if you want to do something like specify a particular individual object, if you want to see change, for example, all right, what happens is that you can't use it for this, because the idea, we think, is that when you have a feedback connection being established, right? Imagine you've got a picture here, right? Well, it turns out that if the process, you know how there's feed forward and feedback processes, right? Circuit, really, in your brain, right? Some of it going up, some of it coming back down. So it turns out, believe it or not, that the upward going wave, right, the one that's feed forward, there's iconic memory, and it can kind of, generate further activity in your brain. But if you need to sort of link it back, okay, you have to actually say, okay, here's this thing at this location. You have to do, say, localization or identification in some particular way. You need to link the higher level representation to a particular location in your visual field, right? So I would say, well, okay, I've got this, I've got this stimulus here, but it's not just, say, a little picture of a cat. It's a picture of a cat right here at this location, right? So to link, right, this abstract representation of cat, right, with the particular location in the visual field, you have to have a backward link. And it turns out iconic memory cannot be used for that. So it's very cool if you do a feed-forward process, you can use iconic memory. But if you do a backward one, iconic memory can't be used. So this is very new work that we're very excited about. And the hope is that we can use this to begin to look at feed-forward and feedback processes and actually separate the two in our perceptual system.
Okay, that's interesting. Has there been any research investigating what cortical areas are involved in change blindness? or in detecting change?
So the thing would be then to, when you do see change, what's involved? Yeah, and as far as we know, there have been some results on this. There's been some work in imaging, looking at what goes on in the different cortical areas. And it does seem to be that the areas that are known to be involved in attention are required for this. So what you'll find is there's activity in V1, right? And so, of course, that's like the picture, right? That's this very volatile picture, the dense one I've been telling you about. And then it goes up to the parietal area and a couple of other areas as well that have been known to be involved with focused attention. And these are activated as well. So when you latch on to the right thing, these activate, and you actually see the role of attention. It actually is required to see the change. So it's, yeah, it's pretty cool.
It is cool. That was very interesting. Yeah. So I was wondering, what sort of factors determine one's ability to detect change?
Yeah. It turns out to be several factors. This is actually a very current area of investigation. We're again on the forefront of research here. A couple of them have to do with just your attentional abilities, just how many things you can attend at a time. The speed of your attention, its capacity, its selectivity. So it turns out that these change blindness techniques are a nice way of finding out what your capacity is, what kind of codes you use, what the sort of visual chunks are. Because it turns out you can usually hang on to 3 or 4 things, and that's it. The question is, what's a thing? And in fact, this is where experiment comes in. We can actually say, well, whatever there are 3 or 4 of, that's a thing for you. So we're actually beginning to get a sense of what the codes are in terms of your perceptual world. And the other related, this is for an individual, the other related development, which we're just beginning to explore, is the effect of culture. So it turns out that people in different societies appear to have a different way of handling their visual information. So they have, Asians, for example, have a different way of integrating the background with the foreground object. They tend to be much more holistic. They see the thing as a whole, both the object and the background. Whereas a Westerner would typically say, here's this object, and then there's a bunch of stuff, right? The separation for Westerners is much clearer. And this actually is now being shown up in change blindness tests, that you can actually tell, because the change blindness technique, right, lets you kind of tell, okay, what are people attending to first, right? And what are the codes? So what we're finding now is that there is a difference in cultures, that if you grew up in a particular culture, your codes are somewhat different, and the sort of order that you attend is also different. So I think there's great potential for investigating the use of, using this technique, for taking a look at how people actually use their dynamic system, right, this machinery they have, how they actually send it around their world. And in some sense, different people literally see the world differently, right? They attend to different things. You need attention to see. So you literally see the world somewhat differently. And so I think this is a great area of research to begin to get a little bit more information about this.
All right. Well, that was all very informative, and I'm sure that'll help out the other students. And thank you for coming in and letting us talk to you.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.